Okay. As you can expect, this is going to be a little challenging Bible study, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
This one's a little bit different. We're going to hear what happened after the flood. It's very easy to skip over this. It's called the Table of Nations. And it explains how we got people all over the planet. Now, what's interesting, I'll talk about this a little later, is it really is in reverse order. This is what happened after the Tower of Babel, okay, of how everybody dispersed all over the world. But we're putting it first before the Tower of Babel, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. God is the creator of every single person on the planet, and that's kind of the point of this. And so we'll pull some practical application out of it. It's going to be a little challenging, but hang in there. It's still God's Word, isn't it? And all of it is good for our teaching, our learning. We just have to work a little bit harder at some of it, don't we? And I have not preached a Sunday morning sermon on chapter 10 of Genesis before. But in this table is God's purposes, God's work. I think it even hits what Acts 17, verse 26, where Paul writes, he says, God determined the times set for nations and the exact places they should live. And I think Paul's referring to Genesis chapter 10. That God set the place and the times. Where do nations come from? Where do peoples come from? Where do races come from? Where do languages come from? Where do cultures come from? He's laying the foundation here. Okay? He's talking about this, and then he's going to wrap it up. If we'd had time, it would have been best to do this and Tower of Babel at one time. It kind of fits together, but I can't talk that long. You know. In its sex, you know. So anyway. This nation is unique, this table of nations in Genesis. Ancient peoples did not do this. No other people laid out where all the people on the planet, at least of that world, came from and how they dispersed and the lineage. No other nation has done that. No other people has done that. It's very, very unique. Chronicles chapter 1 picks up a part of this and goes through it when it mentions how the genealogy between Adam to Jacob picks up what we're going to look at this morning. So anyway, let's start in chapter 10, verse 1, and we're all going to be worn out afterwards. But we're going to go through it together. And so if anybody asks you questions, you know, this is, by the way, this is great trivia for Thanksgiving. Okay? You're going to get a lot of good stuff. Like, you don't get dessert unless you and say, you got good trivia here. Look at verse 1 of chapter 10. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. Verse 1 and verse 32 are very similar. We talked this last week, how he brackets it. He brackets it here. And verse 32 basically kind of repeats the same thing. This is the account of the genealogies of the people of the earth that came from Noah and his sons. So we talked about, remember, was the ark the only way that people were saved? Yes. Because now this table says everybody came from these three families. Noah's three sons and their wives. After the flood. After the flood. Now, they're given in reverse order of their birth. Japheth, probably because he doesn't have much connection or any connection to Israel, okay? His descendants kind of, as we'll see, are up other places. Ham, obviously, his descendants have a lot of impact on Israel. That's pretty much the Canaanites. And then obviously Shem, which is going to where the lineage of Abram or Abraham's going to come from. Japheth was the second born. Ham seems to be the youngest, and Shem seems to be the oldest. And I just summarized an entire book by saying that, because people have been struggling over that forever. and we're not going to talk about it. Okay, now let's look at verse 2. Boy, you know, when you're teaching these things, you just really wish we could give tests. Because this would be a fun one, wouldn't it? The sons of Japheth: Gomer, Magog, Madai, Javan, Tubal, Meshach, and Tiras. The sons of Gomer are Ashkenaz, Riphath, and Togarmah. The sons of Javan are Elias, Tarshish, the Kittim, and Rodium. From these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans with their nations, each with its own language. So we know languages didn't get disturbed till when? After Babel, right? So we're giving all this before Babel, but there's a reason, and we'll talk about that. Okay, first we have Japheth, okay? Again, he doesn't really play a big role with Israel. We start with his first, Gomer, probably the Cimmerians, who basically are southern Russia. Okay, southern Russia, Ukraine, that's really where Gomer is referring to. The late millennium, they were pushed back to the mountains. Gomer also occurs in Ezekiel, doesn't it? With the northern enemies called Gog and Magog, right? We're familiar with those. And they're connected with Gomer. Magog, because of Ezekiel, is just the far north, far Asia Minor. Tubal and Meshach, same way. Madai is common in the Old Testament, and this would be the Medes. Remember the Medes and the Persians that come in at the end of the Old Testament? This really, Meshach is the father of the Medes during that time. And Java is Greek, the Greeks. The ancient Greeks, Ionian Greeks, that would be Java, is who his relatives come from, or his descendants. Again, Tubal and Meshach are always given together in the Old Testament, and they're basically Central and East Asia Minor. So he talks about, first of all, Japheth, those who hit the far northern regions, Asia Minor all the way up to southern Russia, Ukraine. That's where they were sent after Babel. And then verse 3, the second tier are now we have the sons of Gomer, 3 peoples. The Ashkenaz, which are the Scythians, Jeremiah talks about them. I think I put the Old Testament references in your notes. Did I leave those in there this time? Like Jeremiah? I tried to leave them in, I thought. Let's see. Then we have Riphath, and Riphath is unidentified, we don't know. And then Togarmah is in Ezekiel, and that would just be Asia Minor. And then verse 4, the last one here, the parallel of the descendants of the son of Javan, 4 names, 2 pairs. These are all the Mediterranean peoples, okay? Greece, the Mediterranean. Tarshish refers in the Old Testament, ships of Tarshish. Who went to Tarshish, or tried to? Paul, but Job. Remember, Job jumped a ship to get as far away as he could and went to Tarshish at all. So Tarsus is where Paul was from in Asia Minor. So most think this is probably southwest Spain, west of Israel is where these people are. And Kittim is the island of Cyprus. Would be the Cyprus Islands. And anyway, Rodion is the island of Rhodes. So he's laying all this out for us. Okay, hang on. Let's look at verse 6. Okay. Michelle, I need lunch after this. Yeah, Pinot. Well, she was going to share her chocolate, and that's a pretty big sacrifice for Michelle. Just trust me. The sons of Ham. Okay. Cush, Mizraim, Put, and Canaan. The sons of Cush, Seba, Havilah, Sabata, Rama, and Sabata. The sons of Rama are Sheba and Dedan. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who grew to be a mighty warrior on earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's why it's said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdom were Babylon, Erech, Akkad, Calneh, and all in Shinar. From that land, he went to Assyria, where he built Nineveh, Rehoboth, Ir, and Calah, and Rezin, which is between Nineveh and Calah. That is the great city. Mizraim was the father of the Ludites, the Anamites, the Lehabites, the Leduthites, the Pathrusites, the Chalcidites, from whom the Philistines came, and the Captorites. Now Canaan was the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Gerishites, Hivites, Archites, Sinites, Aradites, Zemarites, and the Hamathites. Now later, Canaanite clans scattered, and all the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon toward Gerar as far as Gaza, and then toward Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, as far as Lasha. Now these are the sons of Ham by their clans and languages in their territories and nations. Now we know the youngest son Ham was the one who, right, disrespected, right, his father. Noah cursed him. And then these are pretty much, you probably recognize a lot of those names, didn't you? These are a lot of the enemies that we see of Israel, right, in Canaan. Basically, these are the Sumerians and the Sumerian cultures and the traditional descendants. So let's look at some of those. There's 4 groups. Cush. Now, Mizraim is another word for Egypt. Okay? Is another word for Egypt. It's a plural word, not that you care, but I'm going to share it. It's a plural word, meaning it's Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, because Egypt was always given in 2 parts. Upper and Lower Egypt were almost like 2 independent nations at one time. So Mizraim is a plural in Hebrew, is basically saying that's all of Egypt came from him. And then Put and Canaan. And so we see this. So we have first Cush. This would be Nubia, modern Nubia. It often is in the Old Testament. As a matter of fact, it's mentioned in the description of the garden back in chapter 2, referring to the region of Cush. Mizraim, again, is transliteration of the Hebrew word. It's the Hebrew word for Egypt. Anyway, then we have Put, and we don't know where to put Put. We don't know where Put actually is. Most think it's in that region of Cush and Tyre and all that. Canaan's critical. The term Canaan is typically the strip of land between the Jordan River, modern Israel, and Lebanon and good portion of Syria. That would have been Canaan, right? It would be modern Israel, modern Lebanon, and then a good chunk of Syria is what Canaan today maps out to be, okay? Would be Canaan. This is the land that was given to Abraham, right? I'm giving you all of Canaan, and these are the Canaanites. Look at verse 7. There are 5 sons, not counting Nimrod, total 7 with Cush. We don't know a lot of the areas here specifically, other than their Africa and Arabian area, okay? It's kind of what we know. Now, according to Genesis 10 here, Seba is grouped with Egypt and Cush in Isaiah. So it's just probably African people. Havilah is in that same African region. Sabata and Sabeteka are basically South Arabia. That's what we know. But we do know a little bit about Sheba, don't we? So what do we know about Sheba?
Queen of Sheba.
Right, came and saw Solomon, right? And so this is, again, basically North Africa and Arabia in that area. Anyway, verses 8 through 10. Then we have Nimrod. And of all people, he stops. Remember, we're in the lineage of Ham, which is more the ungodly descendants. And remember when we had the story of Cain, and we had some description of Lamech, remember his son? That great son down that had all the problems and built he built the cities and took pride that he was, right, a violent man. Well, now we have his counterpart in Ham's description of Nimrod. Nimrod was the founder of prominent cities, Babylon and Nineveh, two huge ancient cities. He said he's the founder of both of them. But we get the idea, he did it kind of the same way Lamech did. He built, or Cain did, and his sons, out of violence. Okay? Now, we hear that Nimrod's story tells us he was the first noted ruler and champion hunter. His exploits became proverbial with a mighty hunter like Nimrod, but they're not saying a mighty hunter before the Lord. They're not making him saying he's a great guy. He's a mighty hunter whom the Lord knew about him, is kind of the idea. And we'll look at him a little bit later. He's going to be connected a lot with the tower event. Okay, the Tower of Babel, Nimrod's connected with that. So he's not a hero. Okay? He's an early villain who's kind of going out there and he's building all these cities. And by the way, these cities are some of the greatest adversaries of Israel, aren't they? With Nineveh and Babylon both. The cities of Shinar. And Shinar is Babylonia. And so we see that. This is where the tower is built. Right? The tower is built in one of his cities. Nimrod goes from that land. He moves to Assyria. Micah deals with a lot of him because Micah calls Assyria, in the book of Micah, do you remember? The land of Nimrod. When he writes his prophecy against Assyria, he refers to it in his book, the book of Micah, as the land of Nimrod, which goes back to Genesis 10, making that connection. Okay? And then basically the book of Chronicles mentions Nimrod a lot. So he built these prominent cities. Basically, we get the idea he's kind of like Cain, who built cities. Noah and Abraham build altars. Cain and Nimrod build cities. That's kind of the idea. And then we have the noted Rehoboth, Ir, and Kala, and Rezin, all in that area. So verses 13 and 14, the second occurrence where we have this word, my father, Egypt, or Mizraim, 7 more names where the Philistines come from. So now we're going to hit the Philistines a lot, aren't we, in the Old Testament. And so we have the Ludites, who are the Lydians. We have, basically in that area, the Anamites, the Lehathites. That's all Egypt area. That's where they went, Upper and Lower Egypt. And the Pathrusites, same thing in that region. I know you're going to take these notes home and really work on them in your devotion this week. So, We don't really know the location of the Chaldehites, but it looks like Crete as well. And then verses 15 and 19, we have this third elaboration of Canaan's descendants. Of 4 of Ham's sons, there's no tracing. Matter of fact, there's no tracing in the lineage of Put, is there? His family, we're not told anything. But there are 11 groups that come from Canaan. The first is Sidon, okay, which is Phoenicia. The Hittites. There's a little bit of, I don't know if you know ancient history, but there was a great and mighty nation up in northern Asia Minor, Turkey, their area, modern day, called the Hittites. It was a great and mighty nation. Huge. But it's not the same Hittites we see in Scripture. The Bible didn't have really much connection with those. They didn't really travel far. But it's interesting to read about them. They were a huge, huge people. And we're getting the idea this is where they came from, but there wasn't a lot of connection. And I digress. Now, we also have here the Hittites in Genesis, elsewhere in Genesis. In Ezekiel, the city of Jerusalem owed its existence to the Amorites and the Hittites. They built Jerusalem. And then obviously their fight constantly against Abraham. And Abraham purchased the family tomb, do you remember where? From the Hittites. That's where Abraham. So, again, if you're getting ready to go into this country, right? You're getting ready to conquer, he's laying out how all this works and where they came from and what's taking place. And it's very difficult for us, but again, you don't want to miss next week because it'll wrap all this up. It'll make a lot more sense. I promise. Hope I don't die between now and then, but we'll see. Yeah. The Amorites are really, really well known. We see that. They fought against them. The Gershites. Israel fought against them. We don't know much about them. The Hivites, again, opposed Israel. They're the ones in Shechem who raped Dinah, Jacob's daughter. Earlier is this group. Gibeon, Mount Hermon. Anyway, the Archites are on the coast. And the Avites, again, you've got all that on there. Then he says, from these various family of the Canaanites, they were scattered, which is going to refer to what's going to happen next. So again, they're out of order, okay? Tower of Babel came first, and then all this dispersion came, but we'll talk about at the end why he put them first here. The Canaanites and those of Babylon are all against what God is doing. And then verse 20, the last one, another summary. There's a big summary here about Japheth and the nations. So, we're going to get done a little early, so we're going to have lots of questions about this. Okay, let's look at verse 21. Sons were born to Shem. Okay, remember, Shem is the one who God blesses, whose older brother was Japheth. Shem was the ancestor of all the sons of Eber. Okay, Eber's where Abraham came from. The sons of Shem were Elam, Asher, Arphaxad, Lud, and Aram. The sons of Aram were Uz, Hul, Gether, Meshach. Now Arphaxad was the father of Shelah, and Shelah the father of Eber. The 2 sons were born to Eber. One was named Peleg because his time on earth was divided. His brother was named Joktan. Joktan was the father of Almodad, Sheleph, and Harzmathoth. Jerah, Hadaram, Uzal, and Diklah. Obal, Amiel, Sheba, Ophir, Havilah, and Jobab. All these were sons of Joktan. The region where they lived stretched from Mesha towards Sephar, to the eastern hill country. These are all the sons of Shem by their clans and languages and their territories and their nations. Again, one way the Bible is reminding us that this is real, true history. Right? This isn't just made. These are real people. So we have all this catalog, 4 tiers of names, 26 in all, 13 levels of descendants. The highlights who Shem is and talks about Eber. Now after that, we have the sons of Shem. 5 descendants. Elam. That would be the Tigris-Euphrates Valley. He moves all the way into southwest, which would be Iran today. Would be his descendants. The coalition of the eastern kings that come after Abraham, Elam leads them. Asher is Upper Tigris, modern Iraq. Asher, 2 different groups here. Arphaxad, I know you're holding your breath, and we don't know where his family went. And but one name that's important here is Aram. Now the Greeks call the people of Aram the Syrians. The terms Aram and Aramean refer to a whole lot, but if you remember, what was Jacob called? Remember, Jacob was called a wandering Aramean. Which connects him to this family line that Aaron plays an important role in the Abraham narratives, that they come from Aramean family lines. In case you were wondering and holding your breath on that. Because remember, one of the sons of Aram is Uz, and remember where his father, Abraham's father, came from? The land of what? Uz. Right? They came from the land of Uz. And that's why Jacob could be called a wandering Aramean, going back to his descendant would have been Aram. Okay, that solves that issue that you've been struggling with that I have for a long time.
I feel sorry for the scribes.
Do you? On that note, isn't it amazing that the Old Testament was translated and passed down for thousands of years by being written and rewritten and rewritten? Now, can you imagine being a scribe and rewriting this, and yet there's no change? I told you earlier, that was the huge deal. So this is your fault. There was a huge deal with the Dead Sea Scrolls being found, right? We mentioned that. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were found in 4748, they were 500, the copies of the Bible, the Old Testament found there, were 500 years older than any copy of the Old Testament. 500 years older. And so the big scandal was, or thought was, we're going to prove the Old Testament has been diluted over the years. Because now we have a copy, unadulterated, found in the caves, that's 500 years older than any known copy of the Old Testament. Any book. And people are like, because again, it's all scribes and handwritten, for centuries. And when they finally, by the way, it took longer than it should have, because everybody fought over who gets the credit and who gets control. I mean, they fought over those documents forever until finally computer programming came along and somebody took pictures and then it went out, and then all of a sudden there's no differences. It shocked the world. The Dead Sea Scrolls shocked the world, the literary world, especially the non-Christian world, because they just assumed this is going to prove all the transmission errors, and there weren't any. There weren't any. The only difference was the book of Esther was not included in the collection found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Either somebody checked it out that day, probably because Esther is the only book in the Old Testament where God's name is not mentioned. And that group probably said, we don't want that book. But yeah, it was amazing to think, handwritten, hand-scribed, It's just, We'll spend some time later to talk about how we got our Bible, because it's one of the most amazing stories. If God had to be in it, I mean, there's no way human beings could have kept the purity of God's Word for thousands of years. You know, I can't even tell Michelle something my parents told me and get it right. You know? Okay, so now we're going to move to verse 23. Of the 5 sons of Shechem, only the offspring of Arphaxad and Aram were given. Probably because of its importance with Abraham. Uz, head of an Aramean tribe. Obviously, we know Aram in the genealogy of Nahor and Abraham's brother. In verse 24, we see, again, the rest of the descendants coming from Arphaxad, and then Eber, who has 2 sons, Peleg and Joktan. Joktan gets a lot of attention, doesn't he? 13 descendants are written. Peleg's mentioned, it's kind of just makes a comment, because in his time the earth was divided. The traditional interpretation of that is he was alive when the Tower of Babel happened. And where God went, you guys can't have the same language and the same culture because you just do more evil things. You know? You have the same culture, the same language, and one race, and look what you do. You try to build a tower to come confront me. And so, but we'll talk about that. Peleg, we really don't know much about him. Joktan, you know, we see a little bit of here of this whole group. Let's see, who's something significant? We know Ophir. Do you remember what Ophir was known for in the Old Testament? Do you remember? What? Gold, exactly right. The gold of Ophir is mentioned throughout. 1 Kings, Chronicles, Job, and Psalms all mention the gold of Ophir. Yeah, some of the great best gold came from Ophir. Most think it's, you get Africa to mostly India, as people think where Ophir was. It was the far east, far away. And then Havilah, which is the Edomites. So anyway, we have all this and mentioned all these down through here and where they come from. And then verse 32 kind of wraps it up, and then we'll try to make some sense out of this real quick. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent, within their nations. For these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. So he wraps all this up. These are the clans, these are people, this is where people came from. In other words, this is a true story. The ark was real, Noah was there, the 3 sons, and yes, did everybody come from these 3? Yes, every single person, and we have proof, is what he's saying. Why does it matter? Well, the Tower of Babel is going to explain why all this took place, why it happened. The purpose of Genesis 10, if you're wondering, and I think one reason it's set before the Tower of Babel is to explain that the blessing of God, remember what was it again? To be fruitful and multiply. Remember he told Adam and Eve that? He repeated to Noah that God's still blessing. The blessing of be fruitful and multiply coming off the ark is obviously taking place. They are fruitful, they're having children, they're spreading out, and that's a positive thing. Now, if you'd put the Tower of Babel first, it wouldn't have seemed so positive, would have. Matter of fact, it looked like, man, Noah's sons messed it up quick. We went from Noah getting off the ark to the Tower of Babel, and I think by putting it here saying, God is using all of this. The author has obviously been selected. This is not every single human being that was ever born, right? He's picking and choosing here as God laid on his heart. But the idea is Israel has a commonality with every single nation on the planet. There's this connection in there. Even though in Israel's day, They didn't all look the same. They didn't all talk the same. They didn't all have the same culture. They didn't have all the same skin color, did they? But yet they read this and think there's this deep commonality that we all have. Again, I think it goes back to what Paul's talking about when he talks about God made every nation of people to live on the face of the earth, and he chose their allotted times and periods and boundaries and where they went and lived, which was done as a consequence of sin.
Are you able to point out a spot in following this genealogy where the tower occurred, Tower of Babel versus Abraham?
Yes, we should be able to. It should be in Babylon, which would have been up.
But I meant in timeline.
Oh, a timeline.
Is it contemporaneous with the Tower of Babel? Is it kind of in the middle of this?
It's kind of it's in the beginning of this, because most think that Peleg, who we just mentioned here, when it says that, what was the statement I just read? That his time on the earth was divided. Do you see that?
Oh, yeah.
That was the Tower of Babel. So that was pretty quick. Really, you're talking what, 3 generations then? I think, right, isn't it? I think he'd be like 3 generations, right? Peleg, if I'm reading it right.
Yeah, verse 25.
Where am I at? Oh yeah, 25.
Yeah.
So, Shem had Eber, right? And then Eber had Peleg, and Peleg, it looks like, was born during the time. So it's an excellent question. Yeah, so it looks like we're just 3 generations down. From Shem to Eber to Peleg, and then the Tower of Babel happened at Peleg. Well, again, that's how interpreters take that statement. Good, really good question. Again, people question, why did God have Moses put this first for Tower of Babel? Because Tower of Babel more explains why God split, right, sent everybody all over the place, right? But I think a lot of it because of the cause and effect. If we'd have gone straight into the Tower of Nations, all this would be negative. It almost looked like, man, these Noah people are pretty arrogant. God had to, and it wasn't just them, was it? No, it was all these descendants that came down. And then how, so here's the point, and this is best I can do. People are really, really, really quick to forget God. As we read about this, and you think about it, the stories had to go pretty quick of the great flood, right? I mean, Ham, Shem, and Japheth had to have told that story. We talked about it last week. Of the massive flood that killed it. Everybody came from them. And yet, most of these nations did not recognize God. At all. Even after God will miraculously, right, spread them out with language and everything, they still, of these nations that we know of, the people that we recognize, again, we don't know exactly the heart of every person. I mean, we're not saying that. But there may have been a little more knowledge of God than we're aware of, but from what we know of, there was no recognition of the true God very, very quickly. They quickly made their own gods to reflect their own values. Nimrod's an example. Apparently his name was like a proverb in Moses' day, because it's kind of quoted, basically, he's a man like Nimrod. It'd almost be like saying he's a dictator like Stalin. It wasn't a compliment, okay? It was he was, you might think he's a good guy when it says, a mighty war hunter before the Lord. But really the idea behind that in Hebrew is, Nimrod asserted himself against the Lord. In other words, he was mighty, but in the same way that Cain was. And several clues is, the word mighty one here is exactly the same word used for the Nephilim that we talked about earlier. Exactly the same word of the Nephilim, who were also mighty by their arrogance. Nimrod was like them. And also, Nimrod founded two really evil cities, Babylon and Nimrod. And they reflected his character at all. They did not ever recognize God. Ever. Matter of fact, the opposite. Matter of fact, if you trace the word Babylon through the Bible, you'll find it's a symbolic word for how human beings exalt in opposition to God, and it's even used in the book of Revelation, isn't it? Right? As those who put themselves against God. So Nimrod, and by the way, he's a nephew of Canaan, who was the one cursed by Noah. They're nephews. And then also, I think it's very, very easy looking at our world today the way it is to forget that there's a oneness of the human race, right? Yes, everybody came from Adam and Eve, but everybody came from Noah's 3 sons. Every single person on this planet. There's this oneness of humanity. And I think, that really should put things in perspective, right, worldwide, and for us, especially Christians. And again, I think that I'll give this one, I don't think it's a big stretch, but I had not thought of this. In reading through this again and working on this again, I came up on something that you know how it is. I may have known it once, and then I don't remember it anymore. So, if we count all the nations in Genesis 10, okay? If we went through and counted them all, you can do that after lunch. We get a couple of different figures and numbers, but traditionally, especially Jewish scholars and early Christian scholars, they counted the number 70. 26 from Shem, 30 from Ham, not including the Philistines because they were like a parenthetical comment, and then 14 from Japheth. So there's 70. When Jesus sent out the early disciples, how many did he send out? 70. Remember? When he said, the 12, I'm going to send them out, symbolically, he was sending them out to take the gospel to where? To the world. And so most commentators, when I say that word, I mean people a lot smarter than me, believe that Jesus was referring to Genesis 10. And that his audience, when he sent out 70, they would have made that connection. That's everybody on the planet. You're talking about reaching everybody. And so for us, it's a reminder that God still wants to reach every single person on the planet. And obviously, there's a lot more people groups than these now, aren't there? We had, I don't remember where he got it from. My missions pastor, my last church, he ordered this wall. And basically, it came up and we rolled it out. If I could find it, maybe it'd be really cool. And he rolled this wall out, and it's basically all the people, not just countries, but people groups of the world. And then it mentioned all the ones who absolutely never heard of Jesus or the gospel to the day. That no one's communicating to them. It was hundreds and hundreds of people groups that had never heard. They still, as frantically as we work, as small as our world is, they're still working. And then the number that still don't even have a copy of the Bible in their language is still dramatic, even with our modern technology. And so, but that's our mandate. So that's all I got.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. If you're interested, I didn't print out a ton, but I've got a few of if you wanted genealogies of it, it's basically a genealogical line of everything we just did. I need a new phone now. No. So if you're interested in those, I've got those if you want interested in that. And then basically, please don't have any more questions. So anyway, that's kind of what it is, but he's laying it out, and he's going to lay it out, and it's one of the big questions that people have, Where do all the people come from? How does the Bible deal with that? All cultures, languages, races, where did all that come from? This and the Tower of Babel is telling us where everybody came from and how they came and how important it is, how we're all connected. And God cares for everybody. And Jesus sent out the 70. I personally think that's what he's saying. Just like there's 70 representative of all the world, I want disciples to go to all the world. So, I should have. Well, I just looked down and saw it. That's what happened. Isn't that good intentions? Good intent. I just looked down and saw it, and okay. Let me close in prayer. God, just thanks so much for your word, and this is a difficult passage for us, Lord. But we thank you that you've given it to us, and may we learn the value of all people. And that's why your Son, Jesus Christ, came and died for all people. It's his name we pray. Amen.